Hello, and welcome to today's sermon. We've now entered Holy Week, so this sermon is for Good Friday. That's the 29th of March 2024, the Good Friday sermon. And the readings are Isaiah 52, verse 13, to chapter 53, verse 12, and the story of the Passion of Christ from John's Gospel. That's John chapter 18, the whole of that chapter through to verse 42 of chapter 19. We call the proclamation of the Christian faith the gospel. It is a word which comes from the old Anglo-Saxon Godspell, which means good story. It is the translation of the Greek euangelion and Latin evangelium, meaning good news. Today of all days, the gospel seems anything but good news. Good Friday comes from the same Anglo-Saxon root and denotes the meaning of a holy or God's Friday, rather than good in the usual sense of the word. Our opening reading from Isaiah 52:53 makes the fact plain and clear to all of us. If you wish to be a good and faithful and true servant of God, you might well suffer for it. This may seem an outrageous situation. We may be tempted to blame God for setting up the world in such a way as the innocent can suffer. But Isaiah does not lay the blame at God's feet, but at the feet of sinful, rebellious people who wish to crush the innocent for their own selfish designs. But God can use the sinful cruelty of the world to serve his own purposes. The apparent victory of evil over the innocent servant of God shows evil as a triumphant, irresistible power, sweeping the meek and innocent away like dust. The suffering of the servant is extreme. He suffers gratuitous violence and torture as he is beaten and has his beard plucked out. The servant appears to be taking this punishment on behalf of others who shelter behind his pain. The world saw him as the loser, but there is a purpose to his suffering. It says in older translations of this passage that he will sprinkle many nations. The Pew Bible in our church translates this passage as many nations will marvel at him. But sprinkle could be the better translation, for then it would be a reference to the sin offering we are familiar with in Exodus, where a ram or goat is sacrificed and its blood sprinkled upon the people to forgive their sins. The passage continues, when people come to understand this, they will be amazed and see things in a new light and gain a new understanding of the world. But at the time, they just saw a disfigured victim. They saw a man rejected by God, who was not blessed by God with the handsome features of Joseph or the beautiful eyes and singing voice of David, for example. This servant was despised as being of little worth. The transformation comes only when the truth dawns upon them that the sins for which this man suffers are not his own, as they supposed, but theirs. He was pierced for our transgressions. The servant will be seen as a sin offering, through whose innocent blood they have been saved. That a human being's sacrifice could replace the blood of a ram or goat is revolutionary within the Old Testament. The Old Testament emphatically refutes the practice of child sacrifice, which was so prevalent in ancient religions, as we see in the sacrifice of Isaac's story, in which Abraham is instructed not to sacrifice his son Isaac. Yet here, sticking up like a sore thumb, we see this very notion. It is truly amazing, and we must consider later what the Jews who first heard these words probably understood by it. As the story says, once they realized that this servant was suffering for their transgressions, the people will marvel how calmly he accepted his fate. The servant makes a willing self-sacrifice on their behalf. But at the time, all they did was despise him and did not raise a word of protest in his defense. The servant was buried, not in his family grave, as would be the custom, but he died among the wicked. Whether the rich whose grave he occupies is someone other than the wicked criminals is not clear, but the point is that he died a death and was accorded a burial that were unjustified for an innocent man. Yet the people will come to see that it was the Lord himself who designated this man to offer his life as a sin offering, and therefore his death has served a wonderful purpose. Having served God's purpose, God will raise this servant up, and he will see many children, that is, followers, in the years to come. In words we later find in the New Testament at the baptism of Jesus and at the Transfiguration, we hear that God says the suffering man is my devoted servant, with whom I am pleased. The once despised servant, whom people assumed had been rejected by God, would now be exalted to a place of honour by God. For through his suffering, many have received forgiveness. It is almost impossible for Christians to read this passage without thinking of Jesus. But what might the passage have meant to those Jews who first heard it? It must have had some meaning for them to have been preserved as part of Isaiah's message, surely. And clearly, they never considered it a green light for introducing human sacrifice. Well, Isaiah of Babylon witnessed a remarkable shift in theological understanding during the Babylonian exile. Instead of the defeated Jews abandoning their faith and adopting the more powerful gods of the victorious Babylonians, they had come to the conclusion that the Babylonians' gods were lifeless lumps of wood. From this, they deduced that their God, the God of Abraham, who was told he would be the father of a great nation and be a blessing to all families on the earth, that his God, their God, was actually the only God. It had taken the suffering and death of the Israelite nation by the rivers of Babylon to rediscover their original calling, delivered first to Abraham, to bring the message of the one true God to the nations of the earth. This is their renewed mission as Isaiah sees it, and this accounts for the prophecy's importance within the Jewish tradition. What this passage of the suffering servant came to mean to the Christian community is clear to us all, and I will say nothing further today. The account of the trial, crucifixion and burial of Christ, which we have heard today from John's Gospel, speaks for itself. So finally, what does Isaiah's passage mean for us today, besides that pointer towards Christ which we see so clearly? Well, it has to be said that Jesus is not the only innocent person to have died for the sake of others. It is the ultimate symbol of human love, we are told, of our humanity itself, to willingly sacrifice our life for another. Indeed, as Jesus said, there is no greater love than this, that a person would lay down his life for the sake of his friends. We see such sacrificial love when we read of two young boys venturing out onto an ice-covered pond to save someone in distress and dying themselves in the attempted rescue. We see it in the firefighters who climbed the tower on 9/11. We see it in hospital workers risking everything during the pandemic. We see it when men go to prison or even suffer death for the sake of championing democracy in despotic countries. We see it when young women are locked up and even executed for claiming the freedom for all women to dress as they please. We Christians talk a lot about sacrifice for the sake of others, and to our credit, there have been thousands and thousands over the years for whom it has not been just talk. But we must also acknowledge those beyond the Christian faith who have also given their lives for the sake of others. But above them all stands the cross of Jesus, through which we all gain our ultimate freedom. Amen.